Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Helena, otherwise known as NoJusticeMTG. You know who it is. And I'm joined this evening by Curtis Daly from Turn Left. Curtis, how are you doing? It's good to see you in person for once.
Yeah, I'm doing really well. I'm so happy to be here from the Novara Towers itself. I'm in the aforementioned, apparently called the prison room, but it's an honour to be here. And of course, yes, seeing you in real life is always such a pleasure.
Coming up tonight, we have an exclusive interview with Palestine Action co-founder Huda Ammori following her victory in the High Court. We look at the fallout to Keir Starmer's bizarre statement about Palestinian statehood. The American Democrats are turning off Israel, and we have some exclusive and very surprising polling from Reform voters. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. And as always, make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube Super Chat, or indeed you can tweet at us on the hashtag #NovaraLive. Palestine Action, previously a domestic direct action protest group, but currently proscribed under the government's anti-terror regime, may be one step closer to reversing Home Secretary Yvette Cooper's decision to ban the group. That's after the High Court sided with Palestine Action co-founder Huda Ammori today in her bid to overturn the ban, with a judicial review of Yvette Cooper's decision to take place as soon as September. In a hearing last week, Ammori's lawyers argued that the ban was, quote, an authoritarian and blatant abuse of power. The Novara media, alongside Declassified UK, submitted witness statements to the court detailing the chilling effect on the prescription of journalism. Ammori's lawyers also argued that the Home Secretary's ban was excessive and an undue infringement on the rights of individuals to protest and assemble. Since the prescription came into force at the beginning of July, hundreds of Britons have been arrested, and many have been charged under terrorism legislation. Weekly protests across the country, from London's Parliament Square to Edinburgh, from Manchester to Derry, as well as Kendal, Bristol and Truro, have seen dozens of people, many elderly, arrested by police after breaking the prescription law by holding signs reading, quote, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action, unquote. But people acting perfectly legally to protest either against Israel's genocide in Palestine or Palestine Action's prescription have also been targeted by law enforcement. Peaceful protester Laura Merton was threatened by armed police with arrest under Terrorism Act for holding a Palestinian flag and having signs saying Free Gaza and Israel is committing genocide, accusing her of supporting a proscribed organisation. 67-year-old John Farley was held by police for 6 hours in Leeds after holding this sign bearing a satirical table originally printed in the Private Eye. It says, Unacceptable Palestine Action, spraying military planes with paint. Acceptable Palestine Action, shooting Palestinians queuing for food. Those are just two of several cases. After the hearing last week, Mr. Justice Chamberlain reserved judgment until today, but has now granted Huda Ammori a judicial review. That means that the legality of the Home Secretary's ban will be fully examined and could even be overturned. Novara Media reports this on his ruling. In his judgment, Justice Chamberlain said he had decided to allow a full hearing to go ahead on two grounds. I consider it reasonably arguable that prescription order amounts to a disproportionate interference with the Article 10 and 11 rights of the claimant and others, he said, referring to parts of the European Convention on Human Rights, ECHR, that protect freedom of expression and association respectively. Additionally, he upheld an argument the Home Secretary should have consulted Palestine Action before prescribing the group, and, by failing to do so, acted in breach of natural justice and or contrary to Article 6 of the ECHR. Novara Media spoke to British Palestinian filmmaker Saeed Farouqi outside the court today.
Well, right now, it's important to say, right now, nothing has changed. Okay, the judge has found that there's an argument for judicial review. The law stands as it is. But he did make 2 points. He said his finding on the argument of the judicial review was based on 2 points. One is that this prescription could potentially restrict our rights to freedom of speech under Articles 10 and 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And in that sense, he was referring to, for example, Laura Merton, who was threatened with arrest for holding a Free Palestine sign, something that has nothing to do with the content of the prescription. He was also talking about a general chilling effect where people are worried about mentioning anything to do with Palestine, where people are worried about, even journalists are worried about how to refer to the movement in and of themselves because they're worried that their articles might be seen as supporting a banned movement. The second point he made is that the prescription was done without proper consultation with both Palestine Action, the group, and human rights organizations to assess whether there was an imbalance in the application of the law, whether it would restrict human rights in a way that was not lawful. The British education system is very good at promoting colonialism as a good force for the world that had some issues. Okay, the British position has always been that colonialism was a net positive, but it had some issues around the edges that could have been fixed. In exactly the same way that they will say the invasion of Iraq was in and of itself a principled decision, but it had some issues that could have been fixed. I fundamentally disagree. But if that's the foundation of an education system, I think the British are very unaware of the details of the British government's support for Israel, not only since the Balfour Declaration of 1917, but all the way up till today. And I think they're also unaware of the level of states' complicity today in the genocide. Not even complicity, I would say direct participation. And that's by design, because the military and the government, I believe, have worked together to suppress that information. The only way it comes out is from investigative journalists finding the truth.
Today's ruling comes on the back of a number of extraordinary interventions from the international community. These include a statement from UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk, who described the ban as a disturbing misuse of UK counter-terrorism legislation. Earlier today, my colleague Stephen Methan spoke to Palestine Action co-founder Huda Ammori.
Huda Ammori, co-founder of Palestine Action. Welcome to Novara Media again.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Now, it's been a very long month for you. At the beginning of July, Palestine Action was prescribed as a terrorist organisation by the Home Secretary. You then applied for interim relief to get a stay on that prescription. That was turned down. You then appealed on the same day against that decision, and that was turned down. But following a hearing last week in which you applied for permission to have a full judicial review of the Home Secretary's decision, today you've had a result, and that review has been granted. Tell me, what has the last month been like, and how are you feeling about today's result?
Yeah, feeling great about today's result. It's a huge, huge win and a very important step in our case to reverse the prescription of Palestine Action. I think the last month has been relatively intense, to say the least. And, it's not been easy, but what I would say is it has been incredibly inspiring to see how many people are coming out against this, are fighting against this ban and fighting for their rights to free speech and civil liberties at this very scary moment when the government is trying to attack all of our rights and, worst of all, attack the Palestinian people. But today does mark a significant win and puts us in the right direction to get this prescription overturned.
Now, I want to go through some of the details of the ruling today. So you mentioned there an attack on our rights. One of the things that Mr. Justice Chamberlain, the judge in the case, seemed to recognise is that prescribing Palestine Action limited people's rights to protest and to assembly, including your own. How do you understand that point?
Yeah, so basically it's arguable now that there is a disproportionate interference with freedom of speech and assembly, as you said, and we've seen that play out in practice. All of Palestine Action's activities have been considered now a terrorist. All of our supporters have been captured under this definition, and the wider movement as a whole. People have been arrested for just having, I'm told that they will be arrested for having placards which just have the words Palestine Action in the placards in total. Have been arrested for carrying private eye jokes, just for flying a flag and the Free Gaza sign. The terrorism laws are already so broad in this country. When you prescribe a group like Palestine Action, it's going to affect thousands of people and having a chilling effect on an even wider group of people at a time when solidarity with Palestine is so crucial, as Palestinians are facing a genocide and are being starved to death. So it's really a crucial argument for us to advance, and it echoes what the UN Human Rights Chief just said last Friday in a statement, a really strong statement, which said that this is disproportionate with our human rights and puts the Britain at odds with international law.
Yeah, so you mentioned there people who have been falsely arrested or falsely harassed by the police for holding signs that have nothing to do with the prescription of Palestine Action, as well as that statement by Volker Turk, very powerful statement saying it was a misapplication of the UK's terror law. But we've also seen a huge campaign driven largely by Defend Our Juries, in which ordinary people have chosen to break the law week after week, leading to the arrests of over 100 British people who've simply held up signs saying, and I quote, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." How's it felt to see that unfolding while your group has been under this prescription order?
It's really draconian to see all these people getting arrested for holding up placards, but this is the ridiculous nature of these laws and the draconian nature of these laws. But it has been, I have to say, uplifting to see people stand up for freedom of speech, stand up for what they believe in, for pulling it out there, because this is essentially thought crimes that they're being persecuted for, they're being arrested for, and to see people fight against it in that way. And also it's had a huge impact on the legal case. Not necessarily, one of the reasons I don't think that they went out to do this, but it was a huge factor in deciding to go for judicial review, allowing us to go for judicial review rather than the statutory scheme of POAC, which is meant to be a very long and drawn-out process, very secretive process, which would leave us in limbo as prescribed for, potentially years, even if in the end they deemed it unlawful that we were prescribed in the first place. The damage would have already been done. But partly because of this campaign, one of the main considerations was a judicial review means that the order would have been unlawful from the moment it was implemented, which means that all these people who've been subsequently arrested, if we win at judicial review, will then not have to have individual cases tried in the courts with different results, arguing whether or not the prescription was lawful. And this would basically mean that those subsequent arrests, are most likely unlawful if the prescription is quashed through the judicial review, which wouldn't have been possible through POAC.
Right. So yeah, that's a very important distinction. The judicial review will reverse the order if you win it, which means that all of those arrests will have been, in some sense, not lawful because the law itself wasn't lawful. Whereas if you go through the de-prescription process, it would mean that if you won that, which would take a long time, it would mean that you were at that point de-prescribed, but for the period that you've been prescribed, anyone who'd broken the law would have indeed broken the law. Is that correct?
It is correct. But even through POAC, which, is something that most people would have never heard of and never really need to know about. But even through POAC, even if you win at the first stage at a court, there is no obligation for the Home Secretary to de-prescribe you. Only if you win at Supreme Court is there that obligation. So it's a deliberate process which is just massively in favour of the state, and was part of the statutory scheme of the Terrorism Act. And that is what the state was arguing as the reason why we shouldn't be allowed a judicial review, is because they wanted us to go down POAC, which basically means that we'll be drawn out in this process for years. And also what that would have meant for other protest groups, that the state will then know that they can just prescribe you, wait years to come, and then, well, you've got de-prescribed, it was all unlawful, but the damage has been done. So it's a really important landmark ruling that's been made today, and should serve as somewhat of a deterrent for this happening again in the future to other groups.
Yeah, it does feel to me quite historic, actually. It's not often that you hear of a group or even individuals beating the state, even at this level. And it's very important to say that you haven't yet won the judicial review. That will be coming up later in the year. But as I say, very unusual to hear of ordinary people taking on the state and winning even at this stage. Does it feel historic to you? Is it historic? Am I right in feeling that?
Yes, I think this whole situation feels absolutely insane from the moment we found out, that Palestine Action was going to be prescribed, and it's definitely a moment that's going to go down in history. And obviously, we want history to reflect that we defeated the state. the people united against this oppression and fought it together. And I think that would be an incredible achievement. We've so far had an incredible achievement by winning at this crucial point. You are right, it is a very significant win that we managed to win against the state, and they've got very, very expensive lawyers, as you can imagine, in the court. And it's brilliant that we are able to take this case forward through a judicial review, which will be quite quickly done in relative terms to what POAC would have meant.
Which I pointed out already, but I should point it out again to anyone who doesn't understand that Palestine Action remains prescribed. So it remains illegal under terrorism law to express support in public for Palestine Action as a group. You did apply for a stay today once you'd got the result in terms of the permission for a judicial review. You applied for a stay of the prescription order, which in a sense would have halted your prescription until the judicial review was completed. That was turned down by the judge. Did he explain why he turned it down?
Yeah, basically that there wasn't a material difference between when he turned it down on July the 4th, the day before we were prescribed, to the case now. Obviously, we would argue that that's not the case. There is a huge material difference. However, it is challenging when the state argues matters of national security. But I have to point out that there has been, in the open evidence, as our lawyers have argued, nothing to show that national security was a significant consideration in this case. Despite what the Home Secretary has been saying publicly, there have been a lot of things coming out, and I'm sure more will come out, about the difference and inconsistencies between what the Home Secretary has been saying publicly and even to Parliament, to the actual truth of what she knew to be true, because it's in her own evidence.
Yeah, one of those inconsistencies, if I remember correctly, is the timing of the prescription. Is that right? Where there had been, as it were, some recommendations from various groups to prescribe earlier and the Home Secretary hadn't acted and then just sort of suddenly did. Can you explain that argument to me?
Yeah, so basically they had made an assessment in March to prescribe Palestine Action. It wasn't acted on. There was different pressure from different parts of government and pro-Israel lobby groups to act on it. And then on June 20th, she had said that she was going to prescribe Palestine Action after the Rise Not in Action. But a lot of the media and framing has made this about one specific action, whereas, it's very clear from the evidence that the basis for this prescription is that Palestine Action caused property damage to weapons factories, to Israeli weapons factories that were making weapons to massacre Palestinians during a genocide. That is the basis for the prescription. There's been another ground that we're allowed to argue the case on, that they said was arguable, was that they had a duty, that it's arguable that they had a duty to consult Palestine Action on the prescription, which they did not do. And instead of consulting with Palestine Action, which was, very open, people could easily contact Palestine Action as a protest movement, a domestic protest movement. Instead of doing that or consulting any human rights groups like Amnesty International, Liberty, they instead met with pro-Israel lobby groups, Elbit Systems, and Israeli government officials over the years to talk about Palestine Action. So that is another ground that we can argue, was that they had a duty to consult Palestine Action during the prescription process. And if they had done so, they would have probably understood that a lot of what they are relying on is false.
I mean, of course, it is important for me to point out that those attacks on the weapons factories involved criminal damage, so the commission of crimes during those protests. But I suppose the argument here is that in itself doesn't amount to terrorism. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. It was quite the opposite. This is about trying to protect lives in Palestine and trying to stop weapons being made to massacre people in Palestine. That's exactly what Palestine Action was about. It was about protecting lives, not taking them away, like the government and these weapons companies are doing in Palestine today.
I suppose someone might counter that the criminality involved or the damage to property involved was excessive. Someone might say that, just to put that out there. Now, judicial review coming up. It's like awful to ask people to make predictions, but how are you feeling about it?
I feel quite confident in the sense that I do believe that we are going to win. At some point, I can't predict exactly when or how it will all play out, but I do believe that this is just so ridiculous, this prescription. They've massively overstepped. I think they're probably already regretting making this decision, considering the backlash that they've had. And it's not just that I have that I believe that we can win because of the legal victory we had today, but it's hugely because of the people coming out and standing up against this, and the backlash and the unity that's been shown across different movements in opposition to the prescription. I think it's an inevitability that we defeat this prescription order. It's just unfortunate that in the meantime, Palestine Action is prevented from taking necessary actions against the war machine.
Yeah, I think one of the most amazing things about this case is that no matter what people think about Palestine Action and their activities, they look at what's happening in Gaza and they look at what's happening to a group that many people regard as a protest group, and they think, why is the government spending its time and its resources going after this group when there is this enormous crime, historical crime, perhaps the biggest crime of our generation occurring in Israel, in Palestine rather, right now by Israel. Huda, Ammori, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
On Tuesday evening, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that the UK would recognise the Palestinian state. Well, kind of. That recognition, he said, would come in September unless Israel agreed to a sustained ceasefire and a long-term peace process, allows more aid into Gaza, and stops annexing land in the West Bank. In other words, Starmer is using Palestinian statehood as a stick to beat Israel into peace. It's not going to work, and it also shows just how insincere Israel, as well as the British government, are about a two-state solution when Palestinian statehood is understood to be a threat rather than a positive step towards peace. But later that evening, Labour MP Dawn Butler revealed that Starmer hadn't been completely honest even with his own parliamentary party members.
When the history books are written, they're going to say who spoke up, who spoke out. And I think the announcement today was and is an important announcement, even though it's somewhat confusing, because I was on a MP's briefing and we were told it isn't conditional. So I just wonder in the next few days whether it's clumsy speech writing.
That's interesting. So you were told on a briefing for Labour MPs that it wasn't conditional, and that does seem to have changed now because it's saying this will happen if Israel doesn't end the...
I wonder just if tomorrow whether that's going to be clarified.
Today, Transport Secretary Heidi Alexander did the media round where she tried and spectacularly failed to clarify anything.
What else is this government doing to ratchet up the pressure on Israel then? I've asked you about Hamas, that was your answer. Is it the same answer? Because there are those today who will say this is just another example of gesture politics from Keir Starmer and changing his mind again, like he did over winter fuel and like he did over welfare reform, and cowing and bowing to his backbenchers and those in the middle of the Labour Party.
I'm sorry, that's just not true, Emma. This is about the Palestinian people. It's about getting aid into those starving children.
How does this do this?
But we have had a long-standing commitment as the Labour Party to recognise the state of Palestine as a contribution in a peace process towards a two-state solution. I voted for this in Parliament in 2014. It was in the Labour Party's manifesto that the British public elected the Labour Party on last summer. We believe that the moment is now in order to try and use this diplomatic lever to build international consensus so that when we get to the UN General Assembly in September, we've tried to do something in order to set this region onto a different course.
Now, the first statement about Keir Starmer being a flip-flopper is obviously true, but I think it's fine for people to make U-turns when they realise public consensus is the other way. Of course, when it comes to things like the PIP cuts that she mentioned, that was done because of a rebellion rather because he wanted to. And with regards to Palestinian statehood, they say, well, it was in the Labour manifesto. Well, the Labour manifesto said they would do it at some point as part of a peace process when you can guarantee a secure Israel, etc., etc. All the same platitudes that you hear constantly about the need to recognise Palestinian statehood. And in my mind, the reason that they've kind of done it this way is that they never actually have to really recognise Palestine, because as we've seen from the reality of what Israel's trying to do in Palestine, the reality is that if they do recognise a Palestinian state in September, that gives Israel time to completely obliterate anything. They've already passed a motion in the Knesset to annex the West Bank. Anyway, why would they listen to what we say? And if they do come to a ceasefire and they do pull out of the Gaza Strip, then that takes away the conditions for statehood, with the state, at least nominally, with the ability to be able to actually exist in some kind of meaningful form, because it's been mostly obliterated, but it wouldn't be completely obliterated at that point. So it's a classic, as I said, Keir Starmer move, this statement over Palestinian statehood. In a desperate attempt for Keir Starmer to save his tattered legacy, he's trying to please both Palestinians and Zionists, and has managed to piss off pretty much everybody. It seems to be the Keir Starmer playbook, is that you essentially don't understand how to build a consensus, that you just try and pick bits and pieces from what people want from either side and end up not having enough to satisfy anybody. Now, this was the reaction from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Starmer rewards Hamas's monstrous terrorism and punishes its victims. A jihadist state on Israel's border today will threaten Britain tomorrow. Appeasement towards jihadist terrorists always fails. It will fail you too. It will not happen. This was the response of freed British-Israeli hostage Emily Ammori. As a dual British-Israeli citizen who survived 471 days in Hamas captivity, I am deeply saddened by your decision to recognise Palestinian statehood, Keir Starmer. This move does not advance peace. It risks rewarding terror. It sends a dangerous message that violence earns legitimacy. By legitimising a state entity while Hamas still controls Gaza and continues its campaign of terror, you are not promoting a solution, you are prolonging the conflict. Recognition under these conditions emboldens extremists and undermines any hope for genuine peace. Shame on you. US State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce said this about Starmer's announcement.
The fact of the matter is his remarks also when President Macron of France also did something similar in this regard, that this is a slap in the face to the victims of October 7th, that it rewards Hamas, and it harms the ability to stop this framework from, it allows it to continue. It gives one group hope, and that's Hamas.
There was one response, though, that was a little more ambivalent. Surprisingly, this was US President Donald Trump speaking from Air Force One.
He's on Gaza. Sir Keir Starmer has just announced the UK will recognise Palestinian sovereignty in September. If Israel does not commit to a ceasefire, ease the suffering in Gaza and commit to a long-term solution that would deliver the two-state solution in the Middle East. Did you know that was coming?
No, we never discussed it, surprisingly. It was never really discussed. Maybe a little bit at the news conference, but he was sort of discussing it with you. We never did discuss it, and we have no view on that.
But to follow up on that, I mean, is there any use at all in pressuring Israel now to come to some sort of longer-term solution?
Well, you could make the case that you're rewarding people, that you're rewarding Hamas if you do that, and I don't think they should be rewarded. So I'm not in that camp, to be honest. We'll let you know where we are in, but I am not in that camp.
I think there's a good chance that Trump is just completely sick of Netanyahu and now doesn't mind his allies like Keir Starmer making these gestures that Trump would find politically impossible to make in the United States. But all of those comments were singing a pretty common songbook there. We can't reward terrorism by recognising a Palestinian state. Well, perhaps time to stop recognising Israel in that case. Because, of course, Israel was founded on terrorism. You look at Irgun, Lehi, the Haganah, the King David Hotel bombing. That was kind of principle in terms of the founding of Israel. And recognizing statehood, they say, will reward Hamas. Not only do those completely identify Palestinians and their right to a state with Hamas, but they ignore the fact that in threatening to recognize a Palestinian state, Starmer was clear it would require Hamas to cede power. In fact, many countries have now said that Hamas has to go. And at the same time as Starmer has made his announcement, a number of Arab states issued a statement on their own. At a UN conference on the two-state solution, Arab countries including Qatar, Egypt and Saudi Arabia signed a joint declaration calling for Hamas to disarm their rule of Gaza. That declaration is backed by 17 countries, as well as the EU and the Arab League, of course. Those who believe in the fundamental right of Palestinians to a state also strongly disagreed with the conditionality of Starmer's statement. This was New Left Party co-leader Jeremy Corbyn. Palestinian statehood is not a bargaining chip. It is not a threat. It is an inalienable right of the Palestinian people. Our demands on the shameful government remain the same. End all arms sales to Israel, impose widespread sanctions, and stop the genocide now. And Green Party Deputy Leader Zach Polanski said this. Because he doesn't believe Palestinian lives equal to Israeli lives, because he's totally lost his humanity in his bubble where he sees people's lives as bargaining chips, and because the man is devoid of all principles and compassion. Next question. But what about Brits in general? Well, Reuters spoke to ordinary Londoners about their views on Starmer's plan.
Yeah, I think it's right to recognise Palestine as a legitimate entity, but whether it'll make any difference to what's happening on the ground, I don't think it will.
There's nothing wrong with the plan. We've pledged it for years. We should have done it for years rather than stop talking about it, but we shouldn't make it conditional. It should just be, we recognise the state of Palestine, end of.
Absolutely right. He shouldn't be waiting to do it. He should be doing it immediately, essentially. And he should probably go on further and imposing sanctions for what they're doing in the West Bank and their continued expansions. And really, if you're going to treat Israel is acting like a terrorist state, should be treated like a terrorist state, and yeah, that's how it should be.
All I know about things like that is that when men generally use religion to argue over who owns what bit of land, it's normally women and children that suffer and die.
Yeah, I think Starmer doing this is a good idea. I think it's probably, as I said, too little too late. But yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Now, that solid support for Palestinian statehood is replicated across the country. 45% of Britons think the UK should recognise Palestine as an independent state, with only 14% against, though 40% say they don't know. And it's pretty understandable that so many people should be unsure, because it's never actually explained what recognition by Britain of a state would mean for both Israel and Palestinians. 147 UN member states already recognise Palestine, with France having pledged to join them in September. When France does that, it would become the first state in the G7 to do so. And if Britain and France both recognise Palestine, that will mean that 4 of the 5 veto-holding members of the UN Security Council will have endorsed Palestinian statehood. China and Russia have recognised Palestinian state for years, leaving only the US as an outlier. But recognition is ultimately a symbolic step, one that formalises and acknowledges the Palestinians' right to self-determination. That's enough to irritate Israel, but still doesn't answer practical questions of borders, the capital, or Palestinians' right to self-defence. Now, Curtis, what do you make of the fallout from Keir Starmer's wishy-washy opinions on Palestinian statehood?
What do I make of it? I'm not surprised that there's been fallout from the US and Israel. Any slight criticism or any move that delineates from Israel's position is going to get this kind of reaction. Of course, the US is completely in bed with Israel, so they're going to side with them. And Israel's obviously going to attack him over it. But you're right, it's a weak policy. There's so many things to say about this. First of all, it's insane that this has become a bargaining chip. You heard from those Vox Pops there, some people were saying, why aren't we just recognising Palestine as a state? And this sort of feeds into Keir Starmer's leadership, which is that he's not clear. His policies and rhetoric are not clear. It's confusing. And people are asking, why are we waiting? Why don't we just get this done? But it's not surprising what Israel and the US are saying. Interesting as well what Donald Trump was saying on the plane. He said it's the same. It's like the talking point that's been given to all these right-wing people that recognizing Palestine as a state is rewarding bad behavior or rewarding terrorists. 50% of people in Gaza are children. They're children. So any idea that recognizing Palestine as a state emboldens Hamas. You're saying that 50% of children are terrorists. That's obviously a ridiculous point. But secondly, you want to talk about rewarding bad behavior. Israel is slaughtering innocent people. They're committing a genocide. They're committing an ethnic cleansing. And we're rewarding them with cover. We're rewarding them with arms sales. We're completely propping them up, and not just the UK. That's the West, the world over. It's a weak policy from Keir Starmer, but also, it's not a very good negotiating tactic to turn around and say, "Well, you better, heed our demands, or you better, ensue for peace. You better have a ceasefire, otherwise we're going to recognise Palestine as a state." What do you think is going to happen? Israel are going to turn around and say, well, we're not going to stop what we're doing. Your threats are empty threats. So it just shows how poor of a negotiator Keir Starmer is. It signals once again to the people that he is utterly, utterly weak. And the right thing to do is to say that Palestinians have the right to self-determination. It's a very, very simple concept. Weakness from Starmer, and I'm not surprised at Israel's backlash on all of this.
I did see a tweet from an Israeli media personality, hit translate tweet, because that's what you have to do from these people. The secret technology that we have to understand the realities of opinions within Israeli society, who specifically responded to Keir Starmer by saying, well, by September, there'll be no Gaza left for them to recognise, or no Palestine left for them to recognise. And I'm just like, well, yeah, that's what they're going to respond with. You say, well, we've got until September, otherwise we're going to recognise Palestine. So they just will continue their ethnic cleansing and colonization plans. That's the reality of Israeli public opinion, as has been seen many times in terms of public polling over their support of ethnic cleansing amongst Israeli society. Public polling in the UK and other European countries on the support for Israel has been souring for a long time. As early as November 2023, public sympathy for Palestinians was higher than that for Israel in the UK, for example. However, it unfortunately is not the UK that ultimately matters, as the bulk of Israel's geopolitical support comes from its long-time unwavering ally in the United States. This special relationship may be on thin ice, however. CNN's Harry Enton recently unveiled this polling around the Democratic base's opinions on the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Who Democrats sympathize more with, Israelis or Palestinians? In 2017, the Democratic Party was a pro-Israeli party. Look at this. They sympathized with the Israelis by 13 points, more with the Israelis than the Palestinians. But look at this sea change. Now Democrats sympathize more with the Palestinians by 43 points. Oh my God, that is a change in the margin of 56 points over the course of just 8 years. So all of a sudden, it's the pro-Palestinian position that actually reigns supreme in Democratic politics. Who age 18 to 49 Democrats sympathize more with, the Israelis or the Palestinians? Again, in 2017, younger Democrats sympathize more with the Israelis by 14 points. Look at this shift now. Palestinians, they sympathize more with the Palestinians by 57 points. That is an over 70-point shift in the margin in just a matter of 8 years.
Wow, incredible. Continual 21-month-long live-streamed genocide. It will do that to your public levels of support. It's interesting to watch the CNN host seem so shocked at this sea change, as if an issue that wasn't particularly salient amongst people who just had received wisdom put forward through from manufactured consent from the press, because after 2014, the Israel-Palestine conflict wasn't really at the forefront of Americans' minds. And then we've had almost 2 years at this point of continual photos of children being incinerated, of the stories of people like Hind Rajab or whatever. Of course, that's going to sour people's opinions of Israel, CNN. What else did you expect? It seems as though some of the Democratic Party's foot soldiers may have got this memo at least as well. Whilst people at the top of the party, such as Hakeem Jeffries, are putting their fingers in their ears and hoping that no one remembers all the money they took from AIPAC, the resistance liberals over at Pod Save America appear to have had a Damascene conversion.
And I don't think Democratic candidates should take money from AIPAC or vote to fund military support for Israel anymore. I really don't. In this government, absolutely not. And that especially includes, I think, the next Democratic nominee for president.
Things I want to see Democrats at least calling for is cutting off military assistance to Israel. It's a rich country, by the way. They don't need our $3 billion a year. And hands up, right? Barack Obama signed a 10-year MOU for $3.3 billion a year. So we're part of the problem here. Mm-hmm. Let's correct it. I would like to see talk about sanctioning Israeli government officials who use genocidal rhetoric or who talk about ethnic cleansing openly. We should support a ceasefire resolution at the UN. We should demand that international press be allowed into the Gaza Strip to report on what's happening without an IDF minder. It's insane. The press still can't go into Gaza and cover what's happening. And I also think there has to be a total mindset change in the Democratic Party. When the war ends, we are not going back to the pre-October 7th status quo, because it's not where the party is. It's not where the world is. We're not going to shovel billions a year in military aid. We're not going to veto every effort to recognize a Palestinian state at the UN. We should not take money from AIPAC. And I will hold out hope for better political leadership in the US and in Israel. But we have to also recognize that the Biden era hug Bibi Netanyahu strategy has to be thrown in the trash can for fucking ever. Netanyahu is a bad actor. He's continuing a war for political purposes. He bombs Lebanon when he wants to. He bombs Iran when he wants to. He bombs Syria when he wants to. This is not a partner we can count on. This is not someone who is leading to calm and stability in the region, which should be a core interest.
At this point, cutting off military funding for a government that is starving 2 million people and advertising how they're ethnically cleansing the Palestinians seems like the least we can do.
Especially if we're going to head into a primary, table stakes is going to be no more military aid for Israel. So there will have to be a shift. And I do think that will mean putting far more pressure on Israel. And that's what I think Democrats want. By the way, that's what the country wants. And when you poll Israelis, they say they want a fucking ceasefire. Israelis want the hostages returned through a negotiated settlement. And by the way, that's the way in which the vast majority of hostages who were returned were able to be returned.
Now, it is interesting to see pretty full-throated support for a lot of the kind of actions that people on the left in Europe want to see, such as new trade sanctions, etc., etc. What I will take issue with is the framing that somehow that this is a Netanyahu problem, or well, he's a bad actor. He's only really fulfilling the platform that the Likud party has always stood on, which is that Israeli sovereignty should be between the river and the sea. They've always been supportive, and other right-wing parties and even liberal parties have been supportive of the expansion of settlements and continued colonization of land, the realization that they want to have access to quote-unquote Judea and Samaria, as they would describe it. This isn't a Netanyahu problem. This is a Zionism problem. This is the foundational problems of the existence of the state of Israel. Now, you can potentially say, well, if you want a two-state solution, the reins have to come with, well, that's your lot. You can't do any more colonialism. There has to be something to do with the right of return, right? But trying to frame this as though there is a bad man doing bad things and not a bad ideology that is leading to the bad things that are happening, again, this is a kind of liberal framework that I think falls apart under scrutiny. Now, it does seem to me that just like a large amount of the media establishment, the Pod Johns will say that they have done a volte-face based upon some illusory point at which Israel was deemed to have gone too far. The question, of course, is when was this watershed breach? How many Palestinians was too many? It's not like Israeli ministers and media figures have been quiet about their desires for ethnic cleansing since day one of the genocide. Now, to give some credit to the Pod Save the America team, despite being blind to the real ties of Zionism as a project and the nature of the US-Israel relationship geopolitically, they had actually been early proponents of the ceasefire, John Lovett said so in his interview with Hassan Piker, which was almost a year ago now, and the same with Mehdi Hassan, sorry. One Democratic Party figure who deserves no such credit, however, is former CIA Middle East agent and Senator for Michigan Elisa Slotkin. Slotkin has been tipped by many to be a future potential Democratic Party leader, given her background as an intelligent asset, and has also previously worked in the Pentagon under both Bush and Obama. She was recently interviewed by Crystal Ball and Saga Engetti for their YouTube channel Breaking Points, marketed as a populist unity channel with both left-wing and right-wing hosts. One would assume that Slotkin's advisors saw this as an opportunity to engage with non-partisan audiences on social media in a way that Trump managed to do so on the podcast sphere in the run-up to last year's election. Here's what happened when Crystal Ball grilled her on her previous support for Israel.
Listen, I'm a YouTuber. I have my words, that's all I have. Yeah. But you're a United States Senator. Mm-hmm. You're not the president, but you have power. So what are you going to do? Because so far what we've seen, you voted for some of the aid that's been used to massacre children and innocents. You have backed Israel, as far as I can tell, from your voting record at almost every turn. You voted for a definition of anti-Semitism that would, codify anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. You voted as a member of the House to sanction the ICC for indicting Benjamin Netanyahu, who you just admitted is a war criminal, by your own words. So are you going to join Senator Angus King, Senator Bernie Sanders in saying no more aid to this country that is committing war crimes against innocent civilians.
I think the first thing, if you're asking about what to do with power, and I would offer that right now Democrats own nothing in Washington. So
don't play powerless with me. You're a United States senator. There are things you can do.
In terms of who runs our foreign policy, I just think it's interesting, right, that there was a ton of protests when Democrats were in charge.
There was a protest in Manhattan yesterday.
Okay. I think it's fair to say, just to be honest, that back and forth, like the number of protests that go on now versus before.
It's so interesting to me that she's specifically asked about your support for the sale of weapons used to kill children. And she's like, well, you didn't say this about Trump now that he's in power. And I'm just like, look, people just kind of don't understand the concept of protest. It's about trying to force a change of a position. You don't just do it out of wanting to virtue signal. You have a goal and a cause, and you want to see a change in policy. It's just like the people who say, well, I don't see any protests against Bashar al-Assad. I'm like, well, we're the ones who give weapons to Israel. We have no relationship here. And everybody understands that the Republican Party are always going to back Israel. They're not going to change position on this. They are neocons. They are Zionists first and foremost. The Christian Zionists almost always tie themselves to the Republican Party. There would be no reason to protest people who are never going to be able to listen to the things you have to say. Whereas obviously the Democrats are full of Zionists as well. They're full on supporters of Israel, Biden especially so. At the very least, you'd expect them to, given what happened after the war in Iraq and things like that, and the support for the pullout of Afghanistan, to understand at least somewhat about the reality of this issue. But of course, as we've seen from Lisa Slotkin, she has no intention of actually coming to grips with the things that she has done in her time as a senator in providing aid to the genocide. And obviously to follow this up, Crystal and Saga would question her over the distinction between defensive and offensive aid.
The tools that I have, the tools that we have in general, to me, the most important thing is a pressurized campaign to get aid into people who are starving. That to me is the number one, because that's the one is urgent and today. And that.
But will you cut off aid to Israel so long as they're committing crimes against humanity?
There is a difference between a weapon to protect a country from incoming missiles versus other type. Offensive and defensive weapons are different.
So would you support offensive weapons ban? Like, would you stop any offensive aid to Israel?
That certainly, to me, would be a place to look, but I'm not going to cut off a blanket next sale on a defensive weapon that comes through. No.
I also reject that because, for example, if Senator Slotkin, if you were asked to support defensive weapons for Iran, defensive weapons for Russia, you wouldn't back that.
No, but Iran, but
they're defensive. They're just protecting civilians, right? So how is it different?
But because Israel's being shot at.
Well, so is Russia.
So is Iran.
Yeah,
so is Russia.
Ukraine's shooting at Russia right now. Right?
I'm sorry. This is the difference between allies, partners, and adversaries.
Why is it an ally then? What are they doing right now, which makes it an ally?
I think allied relationships, just like Lithuania right now, like an allied relationship or a partner relationship is a long-standing relationship of information sharing and diplomacy. And that is, to me, it's not a like, every day we decide Lithuania is our ally or not. We're allied or not. And sometimes we have big breaks with allies, right? Sometimes we have difficult moments with allies. Sometimes it goes the wrong way with allies. But an allied relationship is a long-term relationship.
It's hard for me to understand why we should ally. Like, I'm sure you believe in or claim to believe in liberal human rights. Why would we ally with a nation that is committing a genocide and live streaming it?
Can I ask literally, like this, I think about this from the mirror image way, because I do not support the things that Donald Trump is doing, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm an American. So I want other countries to look at America and be like, we can't stand Donald Trump. So we're going to end any longstanding relationship we have with the American people. We're going to cut off any support we give them on information sharing or intelligence sharing. Like, we are not just our elected leaders.
Now, first of all, there are plenty of countries who are looking at what Donald Trump is doing and saying, nope, that's enough. Don't want any part of this anymore. Look at Mark Carney in Canada. The popularity of the Liberal Party in Canada has skyrocketed since his election, given the fact that he's actually standing up to Trump as a bully. Like they said, no, this allegiance, this allyship with America is only as good as the actual gains that we can get from it. And a guy who says he wants to take us over, a guy who says they would threaten to invade us and try and subsume us as an extra state, right? That's not our friend. That's not our ally. That something is crossed the red line. We are breaking away from this allegiance. And that's perfectly reasonable to do. And the same would be true with regards to Israel's quote unquote allies in the West. Insofar as, well, you say, well, it's a long-term relationship. Based upon what? Based upon the fact that, Slotkin specifically understands, as obviously a previous CIA operative, that Israel doesn't really act in terms of a vacuum. It is specifically a US power entity in the region. It's their stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East. In the words of Joe Biden, if Israel didn't exist, America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interests in the region. And so that's the reason why we can't break this allyship, no matter what they do in her mind, even if they commit genocide, because that geopolitical interest is more important than basic humanity. Where in reality, I would not want to be allies with somebody, any ethno-nationalist state, let's be real, right? The UK and the US are both still allies with Saudi Arabia who've committed war crimes in Yemen. That should be going as well. Right? You look at people like David Lammy saying good things about Azerbaijan after the ethnic cleansing of the Nagorno-Karabakh. These are relationships in terms of the things that they have done, which shouldn't be the basis for a relationship of allegiance, in my mind. Those kind of crimes that cross red lines should break apart those alliances if we do not think that they serve the common good anymore. Now, it's clear that the Slotkins of this world do not grasp the enormity of the vibe shift in Democratic Party politics. Both sidesism is a relic of the past, and voters are looking for a principled stance over the genocide. There's also even evidence we have now that despite the political and media establishment conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, the appeal to the interests of Jewish voters is falling away also. In the heavily publicized New York City mayoral election, much has been said of the anti-Zionist views of Democratic Party nominee Zohran Mamdani. He was browbeaten over his anti-Zionist views during the primary, with many of his opponents accusing him of anti-Semitism. He is due to face a triumvirate of right-wingers in the election later this year, and each of them say they're on the side of Jewish New Yorkers. Yet new polling from Zenith Research analysing demographic support for the four candidates gives Zohran the lead amongst a plurality of Jewish voters, including a giant 67% majority of Jewish voters under 45. Amongst the wider base too, it's not just the case that people prioritise economic policy over foreign policy, they support Zohran because of his antipathy towards Israel. This is from Margaret Daraeus from the Institute for Middle East Understanding Policy Project in response to Data for Progress showing a whopping 72% of Democratic New York City voters support withholding weapons to Israel. Support for blocking bombs to Israel, recognise Israel's genocide in Gaza, and holding Israel accountable for its violations of the law is not simply the opinion of the majority of Democratic voters. It is the vast, vast majority. And any Democrat who stands with AIPAC instead of their own voters is running the real risk of getting voted out of office. Many safe Democratic districts in the next round of primaries could be very volatile, and those AIPAC donations, they ain't scrubbing away. Curtis, do you think the tide is turning for Israel in Democratic Party politics, or do you think that the establishment will continue to reject the opinions of their base?
The tide is absolutely turning, but that's on rhetoric and not policy. It's important we make a distinction here, because if we look at policy, it's not really going anywhere. I mean, we were talking about Keir Starmer early on today, and his policy of using Palestinian statehood as a bargaining chip rather than a point of principle. So in terms of policy, not much is changing. I mean, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen media pundits, including BBC journalists, talking about the great noticing. Suddenly they seem really concerned about what's happening in Gaza. Maybe Israel has gone too far. A lot of it is probably down to the footage of people being malnourished and then they're starving to death. But obviously, for those of us who've been following this, who have consistency and an ounce of humanity, we've been against this from the beginning. So in terms of policy, not much is changing. You brought up that clip of the Democrats' support for Israel. It's a whopping 56% change in support from Israel to Palestine in 8 years. Now, of course, that has been a long time coming, but when it comes to the establishment, when it comes to media pundits, it seems like a very recent thing. And that's political change in a nutshell. It comes from the grassroots. It comes from people demanding better. And then, the pundits and the media class and the politicians go kicking and screaming. Listening back to that interview from Crystal Ball, by the way, that was a chef's kiss. Absolutely incredible. Slotkin, I mean, I don't know if she's going to be a front runner or a leader of the Democrats in the future, because she did really get destroyed there. And the reason why is because she had no answers. The biggest enemy, or those that have destroyed the so-called liberalism or liberal movement, it's been liberals themselves. They've been so inconsistent. And Crystal said, look, if you're supposedly a liberal who believes in human rights, but here you are defending Israel. And Mehdi Hassan's done this as well, by the way. They brought up a really good point when it comes to Russia, for example. They're our enemies, therefore we can call them out. Keir Starmer can say they're committing war crimes, they're killing innocent people, and we should stand against them. Fine, I got no issue with that. But as soon as it comes to Israel, nope, who cares? Why? Because Slotkin said it herself. It's because we're allies to them. What that means is we don't care about human rights. We don't care about genocide and ethnic cleansing. If they're our friends, we're going to ignore it. And I thought that was, that was put on display by many people. I saw an exchange actually from Ken Klippenstein saying, I mean, I'm going to give her a little bit of credit. She did go on and get grilled. A lot of politicians wouldn't want to sort of go on and be held to account in that way. And Karl Klinsky said, I give her no credit because she had absolutely no idea she was going to be held to account in that way. And that speaks to the hubris and the self-confidence from the Democrats. They think that they are still these sort of virtue signaling people who have the moral high ground, when that's just simply not the case. So I think, and it's interesting actually, Pete Buttigieg has said that in terms of Mandami, because we know that Mandami is doing incredibly well. I mean, a recent poll has put him on 50%. He has more, in this recent poll, has more votes or vote share than every other mayoral candidate combined. Pete Buttigieg said, we don't need to change policy, we just need to change comms. Now, of course, comms, as we know, is very important. I mean, just check out the Green Party leadership election. We know that comms is incredibly important, but people care about policy. There's no point changing comms when you're still backing a genocide. Mandami is popular because he's talked about bread and butter issues, class issues, freeze the rent, affordable homes, and of course he doesn't stand with Israel. In terms of the point about Jewish people supporting Mandami, he has actually a lot more support with Jewish New Yorkers than other candidates. And it signals to a lot of people that these weaponization of anti-Semitism, that criticisms of Israel is the same as anti-Semitism. Not only are people waking up to that fact, because we've seen it a whole host from the left and Jeremy Corbyn and elsewhere, but since obviously 7th of October, people are waking up to that fact. But a lot of Jewish people are going to be incredibly insulted that their identity is being weaponized. Now, I was speaking to Matt Binder from the Majority Report a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him that very question. I said, he polls quite well with Jewish people, and of course, in the UK, it's a little bit different. His response was Jewish New Yorkers or Jewish Americans are quite progressive in their entire politics. So I think they warm to Mandani in other policy areas, but clearly they're not falling for it. But yeah, I think it's important to note that the policies aren't really going to change. But I think more and more Democrats may try to sort of appeal to that sort of new base, shall we say, of the Democrats. But again, what Slotkin was saying, her answers were appalling. I mean, she was saying that, well, we can't do a sort of blanket ban on Israel because that would be like, turning on America because Donald Trump is president. What does that even mean? I mean, if you were to use that analogy, the analogy would be, well, we don't expect you to give money to Donald Trump's campaign. And you turn around saying, well, I would give money to Donald Trump's campaign because he's the president of America and we support Americans. I'm still trying to decipher that message. There are things Democrats can do, by the way. They do have some power. I know they're not in government, but they do have some power. But also, they can stop taking money from AIPAC. There's a really good way of showing the people that we do not stand for genocide. We don't stand for Israeli war crimes. And if you want to turn around and say, but we don't have the power, I'm so sorry, we can't do anything about it, Donald Trump's in power, well, don't take money from AIPAC. So it's another lie. I am obviously encouraged that the debate is changing on this. And we just simply need to keep up the pressure. What we will know, and what a lot of us are expecting, is many people are going to look back on these moments and say, we were always against the genocide. And thankfully, we've got the receipts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting point there you made about the weaponization of anti-Semitism, even in New York politics. Say, well, actually, New York Jews are very, very progressive, and I think that is true in a lot of cases. And what this weaponization is the dual loyalty trope in reverse. The dual loyalty is this anti-Semitic thing that gets thrown at Jewish people, saying you're more loyal to Israel than you are to our own country, so you have to leave. Right? That's what anti-Semites say to Jewish people, and yet pro-Zionist types will say that about people they don't know who are Jewish and try and paint anti-Zionist Jews as being self-hating, for example, saying, why don't you have loyalty to this foreign state? I'm like, well, actually, when you looked at the mayoral election and Mamdani said, well, I'm just going to concentrate on the 5 boroughs rather than have a foreign trip to Israel or whatever it is, that would have resonated with people. It's like, yeah, my material conditions matter. Our relationship with this country matters. I'm an American citizen. And to try and imply that these people's opinions on Israel are more important than their opinions on municipal politics, quite frankly, I find that to be anti-Semitic. Again, it is the dual loyalty trope in reverse. You're absolutely right. If there's one thing that is central to Morgan McSweeney's theory of electoral strategy, it's that Labour should be angling to win over Reform UK voters. This is manifested by Labour increasing the salience of migration policy and dropping policies that they think are too woke. Yet if there's one sector of the electorate who can't stand Labour or Keir Starmer very much at all, it's Reform voters. As of June this year, Keir Starmer's favourability amongst Reform voters was a staggering -90. Hardly a ringing endorsement of his attempts to woo them with his hard pivot to an anti-immigration stance. And we may have some more of an explanation as to why Reform voters aren't buying his attempts at pandering to their concerns. And it's probably that they don't believe him. People in Starmer HQ may think the voters are too stupid to remember what he used to be like, but the internet never forgets and brings receipts like this.
Make no mistake, this plan means migration will fall. That's a promise. But I want to be very clear on this. If we do need to take further steps, if we do need to do more to release pressure on housing and our public services, then mark my words, we will. Poor housing, poor public services are not the fault of migrants and people who've come here. They're political failure. Political failure.
I mean, of course, Starmer was originally correct. There was a great clip from a Unite the Union representative in the video we released about Lancashire the other day, pointing out that, well, actually, this is a lack of investment problem. Keir Starmer was right to point that out. But of course, people aren't idiots. People remember what Keir Starmer was like. You can just look at clips. You can just find clips, go, what did Starmer believe about immigration? Just type it into Google before 2024 and you'll find out what he meant. And of course, he ran on this in the leadership election. One of his pledges was a humane migration policy, right? He has his name, he'd signed it. He signed it with his autograph in terms of these little pledge cards they had during the leadership election. And it just genuinely seems to me that the Labour leadership think that voters are idiots. Now, whilst most right-wingers will disagree with the left, they usually have more disdain for liars and hypocrites than they do for political adversaries. And now we have the polling to prove it. New polling seen exclusively by Novara Media, by Merlin Strategy, can reveal that Reform voters actually prefer Jeremy Corbyn to Keir Starmer on almost every single metric. A sample of 2,000 Reform UK supporters were asked to rate the two on a variety of metrics and say who they thought best fit the description for each. Corbyn was rated higher than Keir Starmer on authenticity, honesty, strength, intelligence, trustworthiness, and radicalism, and also rated as being more for working people and more understanding of people like those surveyed. The only metric Starmer really scored higher on was how he appeared on the world stage, which tracks given that the foreign policy has always been something that Corbyn and the wider electorate have broadly disagreed on. The man himself said this in response to those results. People have lost faith in a political system that shuts them out of the decisions that affect their daily lives. The great dividers want you to think that migrants and minorities are responsible for the problems in our society. They aren't. Those problems are caused by a rigged economic system that protects the interests of billionaires and corporations. Now, what I think this speaks to is a really big divide, a really kind of new divide in politics, where broadly, in times of political crisis, in times of terminal decline, especially when both major parties have tried and failed, at least they are perceived to have failed in terms of Labour have only been in government for a year and they've already seemed to piss off huge swathes of the electorate and try to triangulate around, picking bits and pieces, just like as we saw with the recognition of Palestine statement, which was conditional, where he seemed to piss off everybody and win over nobody, that people aren't reacting to the centre ground, sensible politics, as they would describe it, of old. They don't want the grown-ups in the room. They want sincerity. They want action. They want people to grab the country by the scruff of the neck and say, this is what we need to do to fix everything. This is the plan that we've got to turn everything around. And the kind of triangulation politics that McSweeneyism, the Keir Starmer Politburo represent, it doesn't appeal to anybody. There was a class of people this certainly appealed to. It certainly appealed to them in the 90s and the 2000s when times were good. And there was a kind of expanding middle class and an expanding asset and home-owning middle class who got the boom of the house price inflation of the 2010s and the 2000s. This was a class of people who were a very aspirational class who broadly saw the economy as good and who could be used as the kind of the swing voter, the Mondeo man of the recent past to try and appeal to. But that, since the kind of gargantuan nature of private capital, of private equity, has kind of eaten into the wealth of the middle class in this country, as Gary Stevenson has rightly pointed out, that voting electorate is shrinking every single day. And given that more people than not are looking at this kind of country as in decline, they don't think the cost of living crisis will ever end. They want to see sincere politicians. They want to see politicians who take beliefs and they stick by them and they stand with them. And I think that is why, that despite their huge disagreements with Jeremy Corbyn on things such as migration policy and some agreements on things like nationalisation and workers' rights too, they are happy to see him as being at least superior to Keir Starmer in the fact that Keir Starmer just lies. He lies about everything. He is a morally corrupt serial liar, in the words of an LBC presenter who I won't name here. And that is one thing that you can't fool the electorate on. They know what he used to be like. They're not going to be fooled by you going, well, at this Labour Party conference, we're going to put up some union flags and we're going to sing the national anthem, and suddenly everyone will believe that the Labour Party has changed overnight. People aren't buying it. People aren't buying it at all. And they want to see politicians who actually have some solutions rather than just tinkering around the edges. Now, this dichotomy can be seen elsewhere in politics too. The Green Party leadership election has gotten a lot more publicity than anyone might have expected due to the breakout performance of Zach Polanski, the deputy leader. His platform is a change in comms and strategy, what he calls eco-populism, an approach rejected by his opponents Ellie Chowns and Adrian Ramsey. The co-leadership candidate spoke to The Guardian about the leadership contest, accusing Polanski of using quote-unquote polarising language and suggesting he could put off moderate voters. Both Chowns and Ramsey represent rural seats won from the Tories in 2024, which, compared to the urban seats won by the other two Green MPs, Sian Berry and Carla Denyer, demonstrates the party's kind of disparate voting bloc. Ramsey told The Guardian this about where he believes the mood of the nation is. I strongly believe that most British people have had enough with populist approaches to politics that seek to simplify everything, that are all about chasing the next headline, the next set of likes rather than real substance. There's no point in just speaking to a certain section of the public that already backs you. You have to communicate in a way that has broad appeal. Now, I want to take on a couple of these points here. Populism is not a lack of substance. This is a really, really important point, right? Populism is about a narrative. It's a narrative of the people versus the elites. The left wing should be populist. It should be populist. It should be the 99% against the 1%. It's the proletariat versus the bourgeois. It's the poor versus the rich. That is the real populism that the left should represent. Do you think Green Party policy represents that? I personally do. That's why I'm a member of the party. I support nationalisation. I support caps on CEO pay. I support universal basic income. I support a foreign policy based on humanity. These are all bits of substance, but it's the framing of this. Like, we support a reduction in CEO pay because they're the 1%. Right? We support nationalisation because it takes assets out of the hands of the 1% for the interests of the people. Right? People are seeing a country in decline, and they want a narrative to clutch onto for whose fault this is. People aren't going to respond to technocratic policy ideas. They're going to respond to, this is who is at fault, and this is how we're going to take the power back from them. And we're seeing this across, Reform and Green Party voters in terms of how they view society. They're fearful about the future and they're skeptical of corporate power and the international kind of capitalist class, was what we would call them, is what Reform UK voters are actually pretty skeptical of, even though their party leader in the form of Nigel Farage also appeals to this kind of people as well, to those kind of capitalists. So the idea that this A, lacks substance, or B, doesn't have broad appeal is just nonsensical. It's just not in any sense reality when you look at real polling here. And again, it's the same kind of appeal to the centre ground, this appeal to triangulation that is failing the Starmer administration right now in terms of making it look like you're trying to be too many things to too many people rather than having a set of principles, sticking to them and selling them to the electorate. Curtis, what do you think? What do you think voters value in 2025?
What I think is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be something called the Great Divide, shall we say. And there's going to be, I think, on one side, ethno-nationalism and hating our minorities. And on the other side, you're going to have left populism. Now, both sides are going to attack the minority. Again, the right wing will attack refugees, will attack immigrants, will attack wokeness. And the left is going to attack the real minority, which is ruining people's lives, the top 1%. That is what I think politics is going to look like in the next 5 to 10 years, because essentially liberalism is dead. I don't think there's a strong constituency for the kind of politics which is socially liberal but economically conservative. That is what we've had for a very, very long time. Think of David Cameron, for example, hug a hoodie whilst also instituting austerity in which 330,000 people were killed. No one buys into that. In fact, it was never popular. I mean, the left hated it because, all right, socially, we had political correctness, right? So we didn't have as emboldened racist as we do today. But on econ policy, it wasn't left-wing, as I said, privatization, tax cuts for the wealthy, and austerity. And the right, well, they hated liberalism because they simply hated social liberalism. They didn't like what they call is wokeness. So I think these are the two things that is that's going to be the future of politics. But for the left, right, it needs to put class front and center. It doesn't ignore social issues, by the way, absolutely doesn't. But it needs to be populist. Now, the polling, where Jeremy Corbyn is far more popular than Keir Starmer, I mean, if you were paying attention, that is not surprising whatsoever. I can personally attest to this. I have a family member who voted for Jeremy Corbyn twice under Labour, still likes Jeremy Corbyn, thinks that Jeremy Corbyn was treated appallingly by the Labour Party, and now votes for reform. Now, for the pundit class, their brains explode. They say, I don't understand how that works. It's because people don't think in terms of left and right. They think of, by the way, political narratives. That's what's important. People give far more credit to someone when they disagree on policy, but they're honest about it. Now, someone like Keir Starmer, what he's tried to do is appeal to everyone. And when you try and do that in politics, you appeal to no one. So when he tries to sound tough on immigration to win over reform voters, people, those who are more likely to vote for reform, say, well, we don't really believe you. Whereas Jeremy Corbyn is far more liberal or left-wing on immigration. And a lot of reform people will know that, but they'll say, but at least we know where Jeremy Corbyn stands. He stood for the same things. And when it comes to left-wing, economic policy, you're going to get reform people on board when it comes to nationalisation, for example, when he speaks about the two-child benefit cap and cuts to benefits, which Keir Starmer still wants to keep the two-child benefit cap. When it comes to winter fuel allowance, that is deeply, deeply unpopular. So I think it's so important that we need to lean into populism. Now, what really worries me is Adrian Ramsey and Ellie Chance. I mean, Adrian Ramsey saying, I'm sick of this sort of populist rhetoric, the 99% versus the 1%. Ellie Chance saying that doesn't have broad appeal. It absolutely does. Trust me, it does. Now, a lot of us on the left talk about the centre ground collapsing. I don't think that's necessarily accurate, because I don't think the centre ground has actually collapsed. What I think is more and more people have been politically engaged. And beforehand, not many people were. So politics was only for the briefcase centrists, and it was their own little bubble. And now more and more people, left or right, are getting involved in the political process, and they're finding out they don't like this. I mean, think of Brexit, for example, the largest democratic vote ever. Think of the rise of, the left wing. Look at polling of this new Jeremy Corbyn Zara Sultana Party without a name. So I don't think it's that the centre ground has collapsed. I mean, all my life I've been surrounded by people, and I'm sure many people watching this can attest to the same thing, that the average response you get from someone is politicians lie, they're all the same, voting doesn't really matter. That's not a new phenomenon. So I don't think the centre ground is really collapsed. I just think more and more people are getting involved in the political process, and they're finding that centrism absolutely sucks. It's also on a policy thing. Centrism hasn't addressed the crisis we faced. So when it comes to, and I think the Green Party has a large portion of this debate when it comes to rhetoric and comms, because I hosted a debate with Zach Blansky and Ellie Chains, and Zach said this Green Party leadership isn't really to do with policy, it's to do with comms. And I find it extremely troubling that Ellie Chains is saying that this sort of populist rhetoric doesn't wash. It absolutely does, because as we go forward, as the right wing is becoming far more emboldened, far more comfortable with their politics. I mean, we've literally had people go on GB News and openly call for remigration, which is fascist politics, right? The left can't dilly-dally and go, oh, well, I don't know. We've got to be incredibly aggressive. We've got to say people like Nigel Farage, people like Donald Trump, they're not scary and dangerous. No, they're losers who are cut to the billionaire class. They're weak. The left need to come out and be strong and say, we're taking on the rich and powerful. Stand with us and say, do you want to go down a horrible dark path of blaming everything on refugees and migrants when you could actually be brave and stand up for the 1%? So the next 5-10 years, we can tell people, choose what side you're on. The side of the oligarchs, the billionaires, the richer, the people who want to get richer and richer, or you can stand with the working and middle classes and stand for yourself against the richest in society.
I think a really formative moment for this kind of populist wave, which has been brewing for a long time, is 2008. There was no reckoning across the world, really. There was no reckoning for the chaos that ensued, the bailout for the bankers that was never atoned for outside of countries like Iceland, where they went to jail, right? In most countries, they got away with it. And that fermented populism ever since then, because we've never had any redress for what happened to ordinary people in the wake of 2008. It led to austerity in this country. The austerity then led to a more Brexit as well. So there's been a continual backlash against the fact that the capture of society by the elite class has never been reined in. It's about trying to funnel this into the right direction to ensure that people focus on these people. Because a lot of talk about elites, about cultural elites. You see what Matt Goodwin says, that there's an elite class of academics. I'm like, well, are they the elites other than the bankers? But that's a compelling narrative that's being sold there. The only way, and I mean the only way that the left can win, is having a contrary narrative that speaks to real material concerns that people are facing right now. We have to fight back against the populist narratives coming from the right with populism of the left. And that's why I think that we see the rise of a new party of the left, the rise of Zach Blansky with the Greens as an important watershed moment in how we come back and redress and right the wrongs that were never righted in the first place. Thank you very much, Curtis, for joining me tonight.
Thank you so much. It's really nice being in the studio, so I've enjoyed my time today. And of course, your excellent takes as always, Helena.
And thanks everyone for tuning in as well. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.